On the morning of October 30, 1928, an entirely ordinary day began at the small town hall of Lake Bluff. A city employee named Chris Lewis was asked to do something outside his usual duties. Go down to the basement to light the furnace. There were no alarms, no cries for help, no reason to believe that this morning would be any different from the rest. He descended the cold stone steps, inserted the key, and opened the door to the furnace room. In that exact moment, there was one small detail that would only be recognized as wrong much later. The woman standing in front of the furnace was still alive. She was naked, unsteady on her feet. Her body burned so severely that bone was visible. Yet she was conscious enough to whisper a single word, "Water." Then she collapsed onto the floor, not yet dead, carrying with her something more dangerous than any flame in that room. Her words, because in the hours that followed, this woman would offer not one, but three completely contradictory versions of the truth. And before everything sank into silence, no one managed to determine which of them was real. So who was this woman? And why did her appearance become the greatest fracture in the otherwise peaceful history of the entire town? The woman removed from the basement that morning was quickly identified as Alfreda Knack, 29 years old, a resident of Deerfield, approximately 15 miles south of Lake Bluff. Within the community, Alfreda's name was familiar in a positive sense. She had studied at the University of Chicago, worked as a school teacher, and for years had been actively involved in her local church, where she regularly taught Sunday school. Those who knew her described Alfreda as gentle, deeply religious, disciplined, and stable. There was no recorded history of mental illness, no pattern of self-destructive behavior, no known social, financial, or family conflict. After leaving full-time teaching, she worked as a book sales representative for a Chicago publishing company and was considered successful in her role, financially independent, and clear about her direction in life. At that time, no one viewed Alfreda as someone at risk. No one believed she was in crisis. No one questioned her safety as she moved through her ordinary routines. If one person in town had to be chosen to be associated with an unimaginable scene like this, Alfreda would have been the last anyone expected, and it was precisely that sense of complete normalcy that made the next question impossible to avoid. What, in the final 24 hours of Alfreda Knack's life, began to slip out of control? October 29, 1928 began as an ordinary workday for Alfreda Knack. That morning, she left Deerfield and traveled to Chicago, where she was scheduled to give a professional talk to colleagues in the publishing industry. There were no signs of stress, no indications of distress. Everything unfolded according to plan. During the day, Alfreda called her sister in a calm, cheerful tone, mentioning that she had purchased some new sheet music and would be home around 7:30 that evening. It was the last time her family would ever hear from her. At approximately 6 p.m., Alfreda left the office and boarded a northbound train, a routine trip she had taken many times before. Around 8 p.m., she disembarked in Highland Park. Under normal circumstances, she would have simply boarded a bus from there to return home to Deerfield. But that evening, the bus schedule had changed. The route she expected was no longer running. The safest option was to wait, but doing so would have meant sitting at the station for several hours late into the night. Instead of waiting, Alfreda made a different decision. She checked her belongings at the station and purchased a round-trip train ticket to Lake Bluff, a quiet suburban town farther north. It was not a transit hub, nor a necessary stop on the way home. At approximately 9:40 p.m., Alfreda stepped off the train in Lake Bluff. No one reported her missing. No alarm was raised. There was no immediate reason to view this decision as dangerous at the time. But from the moment Alfreda left Highland Park, her options began to narrow. With each step forward, turning back became more difficult. If she had simply missed a bus, why didn't she wait? Why did she continue deeper into the night? And more importantly, what had brought her to Lake Bluff? And who was she there to see? When Alfreda Knack arrived in Lake Bluff on the night of October 29, only one name was directly connected to the reason she had come to the town. That name was Charles W. Hitchcock, 52 years old, the night policeman of Lake Bluff. At the time, Charles was a familiar figure in the community. He was married, had 5 children, and was regarded as a man of standing in the town. As the night policeman, City Hall was a place he regularly occupied, the operational center of Lake Bluff's security after dark. In the days following Alfreda's discovery in the furnace room, she told investigators that she was in love with Charles Hitchcock. She did not describe the relationship in ordinary terms, but as a connection she believed to be spiritual in nature. According to her account, that belief was what brought her to Lake Bluff that night, with the expectation that Charles would be at City Hall. Charles denied the story in its entirety. He stated that he had never had a personal or romantic relationship with Alfreda, nor had he ever encouraged her to come see him. More critically, at the time in question, Charles had a broken leg and was confined to a cast. Medical records confirmed that his mobility was severely limited, making it highly unlikely that he could have left his residence during the night. To investigators, this amounted to an almost perfect alibi. What complicated matters further was Alfreda herself. When investigators suggested that Charles might be arrested for what had happened to her, she objected strongly, insisting that such an action would be unjust. The only person with a clear motive also appeared to have the strongest proof that he could not have done it. And as the possibility of Charles Hitchcock being directly responsible began to fade, the central question of the case was forced in another direction. If it was not Charles Hitchcock, how did Alfreda enter City Hall, and what was truly waiting for her inside? In her initial statement at the hospital, Alfreda Knack said that she entered Lake Bluff City Hall that night by unlocking a rear door with a key she claimed to have in her possession. She believed that Charles Hitchcock, the night policeman, would be there. When she did not find him, Alfreda continued deeper into the building. According to her account, she made her way down to the basement and entered the furnace room. Rather than leaving, she decided to remain there overnight. There was no description of panic, no mention of an emergency. It was presented simply as a choice, made within circumstances she believed were still under control. Alfreda stated that near dawn, she developed the idea of deliberately burning herself as an act with spiritual meaning. She did not describe it as an impulse, but as a deliberate decision, explained through personal belief. At the time, this account was recorded without immediate challenge, but when placed beside the physical scene, gaps began to appear. No key was ever found. There was no evidence that Alfreda had authorized access to City Hall after hours. No record suggested that a private citizen could freely enter the building's basement at night. The building system was designed to close after business hours. Doors were not intended for public access. Technical areas were not meant for occupancy. The assumptions that led Alfreda to believe the situation was safe began to collide with how the building actually functioned. If this story were true, why did the scene fail to support a single detail? And when words could no longer stand on their own, what did the scene itself reveal that her account could not conceal? When investigators returned to the furnace room in the basement of City Hall, they did not begin with statements. They began with what remained on the floor. Near the mouth of the furnace, Alfreda's handbag had been placed neatly. Beside it were her shoes and her wristwatch. Everything was positioned deliberately, with no sign of disturbance. But all of her other clothing was gone. Her coat, her dress, her hat. None of it was found in the room or anywhere nearby. Inside the furnace ashes, only a few charred metal fragments remained. Small details, enough to confirm that clothing had once been there, but not enough to reconstruct it. There was no intact fabric, no indication that the clothes had been removed in haste, only their complete absence. Then came the detail that could not be overlooked: blood. On the floor of the furnace room, investigators documented fresh blood stains. This was the moment the physical scene began to diverge from the account that had been given. Severe burns, especially deep burns, do not typically cause bleeding. Blood vessels are destroyed almost immediately. There is no clear reason for blood to be present in that quantity. The presence of blood suggested something else, that an injury had occurred before the fire ever touched her skin, that there was a moment of lost control before everything crossed into a point of no return. If this had been an act of self-inflicted harm, why was there blood, and why had her clothing disappeared? And as the scene began to speak in a different direction, when did Alfreda begin to change her own story? In the hours immediately after she was taken to the hospital, Alfreda Knack remained conscious. Despite the severity of her injuries, she was able to speak, and what she said quickly became the center of the investigation. Her first version was clear. Alfreda stated that she had done this to herself. She described the act as voluntary, connected to personal belief and spiritual meaning. At that stage, no one else was mentioned. There was no suggestion of coercion. Responsibility rested entirely with her. But the story shifted when Alfreda was allowed to see Charles Hitchcock at the hospital. Confronted with the man she said she loved, Alfreda withdrew her earlier statement. She said that she had not done it. There was no extended explanation, no added detail, only a brief denial. Before that change could be examined, Alfreda's condition deteriorated rapidly. In the final hours of her life, as her consciousness faded and her body began to fail, she experienced a rare moment of clarity. In front of family members and medical staff, Alfreda spoke clearly, word by word. "I didn't do it. They did." Those were her final words. There was no further explanation, no names, no context. Only one detail that could not be ignored. They was plural. One person, three accounts, and none of them fully aligned. A person on the brink of death rarely lies. So why did Alfreda change her story at the moment when she had nothing left to lose? And when words could no longer be trusted, what would Alfreda's body reveal in her place? After Alfreda Knack passed away, her body was sent for autopsy. At this point, there were no more statements to consider. Only physical evidence remained, and that evidence began to point in a different direction. The autopsy report documented a severe blow to the head. The force was sufficient to cause disorientation or loss of consciousness. This was not an injury that could plausibly occur after the body had already suffered extensive burns. It came first. Examiners also noted tissue and vascular damage consistent with contact involving high-voltage electricity. This was not identified as the immediate cause of death, but it indicated that the body had been exposed to a powerful electrical source. Just outside Lake Bluff City Hall stood a high-capacity electrical transformer. This detail never appeared in Alfreda's account, but it existed within the physical environment. Then, there were the burns. Alfreda had sustained third-degree burns on multiple limbs, deep burns that destroyed tissue, nerves, and blood vessels. According to medical experts, under normal physiological conditions, the pain from even a single injury of this severity would be enough to cause rapid loss of consciousness. To carry out the sequence Alfreda had described, a person would have needed to inflict severe burns on several parts of the body while remaining upright, mobile, and capable of continuing the act. Physicians concluded that such a sequence was nearly impossible. No definitive conclusion was issued at this stage. But from this point forward, the theory of self-inflicted injury no longer held up under physiological scrutiny. When testimony had fractured and science no longer supported it, Alfreda Knack's body was left as a question without an answer. And it was that unanswered space that carried the story toward its end. Nearly 100 years have passed since that morning in the basement of Lake Bluff City Hall. Yet the case has never truly been closed, not because of a lack of theories, but because no single theory can stand on its own. Self-inflicted injury, assault, psychological manipulation. Three explanations exist side by side, colliding with one another, yet none strong enough to fully replace the others. No one was ever prosecuted. The investigation ended without a verdict. In the years that followed, multiple confessions emerged, only to be dismissed as false. Charles Hitchcock was later arrested on unrelated charges, causing suspicion to resurface once again, but still without leading to any official conclusion. The case faded from legal records, but it never disappeared from the community's memory. What remains is not an answer, but a void created when testimony contradicts itself, when physical evidence refuses to align, and when the system chooses to stop rather than continue. Lake Bluff carried on. City Hall remained standing, but the events of that night became part of an unspoken history, passed down through restraint and silence. There are cases that are not forgotten because evidence is missing, but because the truth is too inconvenient to be spoken. And the question that remains unanswered to this day is this: if the same events were to occur in the modern world, with today's tools and standards, would that silence still be able to last for nearly a century? If you want to continue exploring stories where systems stopped before the truth could be fully named, stay with us for the cases that come next.